And I know, Minister, this is an interest, I think, to every deputy on every side of the House. And while I'm moving this particular amendment, I know from both government and opposition TDs right across the Midlands, there's unanimous support for the principle behind what I'm proposing here. And look, the reality is within the next few weeks, both Lanesborough and Shannonbridge power stations are going to shut down for the last time. It's really the end of an era in terms of peak production and employment right across the Midland counties. Now, 12 months ago, Minister, we had a debate in relation to the need to put proactive supports in place across the Midland counties. And during the passage of the Finance Bill last year, I tabled at report stage these particular amendments which had been rejected. And the difficulty is, Minister, in the last 12 months, very little has progressed. I have to say that Kieran Mulvey, who was appointed by the government as the Just Transition Commissioner, has done an exceptional job, and I think he's been very open and frank with communities. He has made very clear recommendations, but disappointingly, those recommendations have not been followed through by government. And we had a very tight window here. When the Just Transition Commissioner made recommendations, they needed to be acted upon. One of those recommendations was that there needed to be changes sought to the EU state aid rules. Now, it is up to you, Minister, to seek those flexibilities in relation to EU state aid rules. And look, it's not just here in Ireland that we need these flexibilities. I think right across the coal regions across the EU, and peat here in Ireland is very similar to coal in most other continental European countries. And the European Committee of the Regions produced a report earlier this year where it specifically highlighted the need to introduce flexibilities in terms of EU state aid rules, so that the state and state agencies and local authorities could directly invest in community projects. Because there is no point, Minister, through government, through the carbon funds and the Just Transitioner and ministers encouraging communities to think big if there is no mechanism to actually access the funding that is then needed. And yes, there has been funding through the carbon taxes gone into those communities. But I'll give you an example of one community who received €100,000, which was very welcome in Ballyforden in County Roscommon. It straddles the border between Roscommon and Galway, a rural community. They're losing one of the Bordnamona works down the road from it. One of the workshops is down the road, having a big impact on employment. There, historically, there were hundreds of jobs there between Bordnamona and Gowla Farms, and over time they have diminished and diminished and diminished. Now we see the final closure of that particular workshop, and they applied to the Just Transition Fund. They were successful in accessing funding to draw up a plan for their community, and they have a lot of very good innovative ideas. But they do not have the 10% in funding that is required to match with that. They have no mechanism to raise that at the moment because of COVID-19. They have turned to the local authority, and the local authority have said they're not in a position to help them. So as a result of that now, the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment is breaking up that grant into smaller pieces. But they still have to go and beg, borrow and steal to try and get the co-funding aspect of that. So here is a community which is acknowledging that there is a problem, rather than going out onto the streets and protesting and putting their hands in their pockets and saying there's nothing we can do about it. They've actually proactively gone out, rolled up their sleeves, come forward with innovative ideas which have been acknowledged under the Just Transition Fund, but they can't get the project off the ground now because of that co-funding issue. And that's just one example, Minister. It is right across the Midland counties. This is becoming a barrier. So on one hand, we have the barriers from state and under state aid rules in supporting this just transition, where communities are coming up to the mark. And I have to say, in fairness, within my own constituency and the bordering communities, I have to honestly say that each and every one of those communities are taking a proactive approach in relation to this, are looking at it as potentially an opportunity to reconfigure the local economy, but someone has to meet them halfway in relation to that. The other side of that, Minister, is to try and put incentives in place for the private sector to come on board. And that is the purpose of this amendment and the amendment that I'll speak to later, Amendment 159. And it is specifically in relation to this. It's looking at the 20 Bord na Móna workshops across the Midland counties, from East Galway right the way over to Kildare and down to Tipperary, right up to North West Meath, where these 20 sites are going to be mothballed by the end of this year. And what I'm looking for is some type of a specific incentive to be put in there to encourage private sector investment onto each of those sites. And they have the advantage in that they have the electricity supply there, the three-phase electricity that would be needed. They're very large sites. There is sheds available there, very large sheds that can be used for light engineering works and so forth. They have the skill set there in terms of the employees who would have worked in those workshops with Bord na Móna. But we really need to see private sector companies looking at those locations rather than, you know, the reality is that the Midlands in terms of investment has been the poor relation. In general, a lot of private sector investment will go to the seaboards, to the cities and the urban areas around our island, not to the Midland counties. We've always been, you know, the poor relation in relation to that, whether it's in terms of foreign direct investment or Indigenous investment. And what I'm asking here is that we would put an incentive in place, a very focused, targeted extension system in place for 20 specific sites in the Midland counties to say to the private sector, look, come and look at these sites. These are sites that, you know, you can deliver on your objective as a business. The government is actively supporting you in coming to these particular sites. We have the local workforce, and that we can create long-term sustainable jobs at these particular locations. And, you know, it is frustrating that everyone is talking about the just transition, the move from brown to green, and I've, as Minister, fully supported that. But the intention was, and your intention when we discussed this, was that we'd see that transition happen over a 10-year period. Now we've seen it happen over a 12-month period. And the mechanisms of government have not reacted in the same manner that the decisions have been taken to shut down these particular facilities. So because of that, I believe that it is vitally important that we would have a very targeted, focused scheme put in place to actually encourage investment in this particular area. And, you know, it's not just on the industrial side. You know, and in fairness to some of the state agencies, they are now beginning to look at how we can support the Midland counties, and we will in the next couple of weeks see Fáilte Ireland publish its River Shannon Master Plan, which will hopefully be used as a blueprint to develop tourism along the Shannon corridor. They will be producing another master plan for the Beara Breffni Way, which will deal with another aspect and a corridor across those Midland counties, and specifically those communities that have been affected by the decision by the ESB and Bord na Móna. But at the same time, when it comes specifically to government decisions, those decisions fail to actually recognise the unique aspects of the Midland region. And I'll give you a practical example. This is one, Minister, I brought up with you last July in terms of the Stay and Spend initiative. You know, I think everyone welcomes the principle and the core objective behind what you were doing in relation to it. And I accept because of lockdown, it has not got off the ground. And maybe, Minister, you might respond to me, if you can now or later on in the day, as to what was the projected spend or cost to the Exchequer for Stay and Spend this year, and the projected spend for the early part of next year in relation to that. You know, just to get an idea of what we were looking at spending. But as I said to you before, that scheme deliberately discriminated against the Midland counties. And I give you one example, Minister. The Stay and Spend scheme, you can only use Fáilte Ireland approved accommodation. Now, if you take the county of Kerry, there are 155 registered bed and breakfasts with Fáilte Ireland in County Kerry. In County Westmeath, there are 15. In County Roscommon, there are 10. There are 9 in County Offaly, 3 in County Longford, and 5 in County Laois. So, straight away, that Stay and Spend scheme, because of its structure in terms of you could only use Fáilte Ireland approved accommodation, meant that it didn't apply in any real terms to the Midland counties. And if you look at hotels, look at any other benchmark in relation to it, we lost out in relation to that. Now, disproportionately, we don't have the same scale in terms of tourism across the Midlands. So we're always going to be at a disadvantage, and the reality is probably the tourism had less of an impact in our region than it did in other regions because they had a much better developed tourism sector. However, there was a golden opportunity here to bring people into our region within an hour's commute of the city of Dublin. People didn't have to travel long distances. It would have been an ideal location for short breaks. But the structures, when they were designed, discriminated against our region in terms of the way they were designed. Now, I don't believe that that was deliberate, but that's, in fact, the practical reality of it. So, my difficulty is here that while government acknowledges that we have a challenge across the Midland counties, has put a Just Transition Commissioner in place, when it actually comes to practical decisions, they are not discriminating in favour of the Midland counties, which is the exact opposite to the announcement that was originally made when the decision was made by the ESB. The announcement was that in terms of all government schemes, that there would be consideration and weighting given to the fact that applications were coming from the Midland counties, from Midland communities that were directly impacted by the closure of the ESB and Bordnamona facilities across the Midlands. It isn't happening, Minister. So that's why I think it is imperative that we stitch in black and white into legislation these specific 20 Bordnamona workshop sites right across the Midland counties, distributed right across all of those 7 counties, and say, look, we want to see investment come into these locations. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Naughten. My apologies. It was suggested that we take Amendment 158 and 159 together. Do you feel you've covered 159?
I can talk to 159 and the Minister can respond to both. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
There's no problem in relation to that. So just the Amendment 159, Minister, then is specifically in relation to the 2 ESB sites in Lanesborough and Shannonbridge. And look, I'm not going to go over what I've just said, but just to add to that, Kieran Mulvey has been very frank and open and has really been while I think very fair to all sides involved, has been very clear in his views on issues. And look, he's someone that knows how government works. But Kieran Mulvey has come out very publicly and said that the ESB should not proceed with the demolition of Lanesborough and Shannonbridge power stations. Now, the ESB official policy on this is, while they are advertising looking for contractors that will come in and demolish both sites, they are still considering other options for those sites. But the difficulty is that the ESB are considering options for those sites internally, within the ESB as a company. Now, absolutely, if the ESB was the run-of-the-mill private company, you could fully understand that. But the ESB is not a private company. It is a semi-state company. And while absolutely it's a commercial mandate, and I don't disagree with that, the fact is that it cannot, under any circumstances, squat on a site to inhibit investment in the region, because the company was set up for a specific purpose. Yes, electricity supply, but it was also about providing employment. And I think that view is being missed by the ESB. Absolutely, I don't expect the ESB to employ staff if there is no work for them. But I do expect the ESB that if they cannot utilise a site to create employment and retain employment, that they would release that site to someone who will do that. And rather than coming in with a lump hammer and demolishing that site, which is the intention at the moment. And as I say, the ESB are looking internally at the potential use of the sites in Lanesborough and Shannonbridge and the stations. And the reality is the ESB does not have a use for Lanesborough and Shannonbridge power stations. Now, Minister, each and every one of us have paid for those two power stations through our electricity bills. They're completely paid for. And both facilities have a further 10-year lifespan before they require a major refurbishment. So the taxpayer, the electricity users in this country, has both of those power stations free of charge for the next 10 years. And that was the reason why there was a 10-year transition put in place for Bordnamona from brown to green. Now, they are strategic sites. They are extremely useful for other potential investors. But the ESB is saying, well, there's issues in relation to title, there are adjoining landowners, there are rights of access. Every excuse under the sun is going to be brought up as to why they cannot or should not dispose of those strategic sites. And, Minister, I want a commitment from government that if the ESB has no use for these in power generation, and if the ESB were to demolish those sites, then those sites must be disposed of by the ESB for employment creation within the Midlands. And that is important, because I think if government comes out and clarifies that, I think the ESB will think again. I think the ESB will not proceed with their plan to demolish those two power stations, and will, for the first time, look constructively at other options. Now, Minister, I have already been presented with two very viable options for both Lanesborough and Shannonbridge, where they would produce green electricity. And this time last year, I put a proposal which I personally believe is still a viable option for a third avenue, and that is to go to 100% biomass on either or both of those power plants. And I think by using the existing Bordnamona rail network and by supporting local landowners to grow willow and biomass, I believe that we can make at least one of those power stations financially viable to consume biomass for power generation and create a significant number of jobs, as well as sequestering carbon from our environment. So I think, I can go through you in detail, 3 separate viable options in terms of power gen on those sites, and they're not being considered by the ESB at the moment. And I believe that it is very, very wrong. And we've had a discussion already yesterday in terms of the challenges that we have in terms of power generation, in terms of stability on the grid as a result of data centres. And we have a big challenge in relation to that, particularly from 2025 on, when we won't have enough generation capacity at present within the country to meet the huge demands that are going to be placed on our electricity grid by data centres. And yet, at the same time, we're planning to demolish 2 power stations within the Midland counties, which are strategically located on our grid in terms of grid stability, particularly to providing a reliable electricity supply to the northwest of this country. And we're planning to demolish those when there are viable options there, when there are options that really need to be fully considered. So I think we need to ensure that those 2 power stations are not demolished, that we do look at other viable options, and that we put an incentive in place, as outlined here in section 159, to look at viable alternatives for those sites that can create employment and hopefully bring about a different approach from the ESB. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Naughten. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Naughten. Before addressing the substance of these amendments, I'd like to take the opportunity to advise the committee that I'm considering bringing forward an amendment at report stage on the matter of accelerated capital allowance for farm safety and adaptive equipment. To deal with the important issues that Deputy Naughten has raised with me, with regard to his first proposed amendment for an enhanced form of the employment and investment incentive. This incentive is a state aid measure operating within the EU's general block exemption regulations, and as such it applies equally to all regions in the state. A regional variation of EII would require separate state aid approval from the European Commission. At the moment, areas along the border, for example, could equally make the point that their SMEs are facing particular difficulties that similarly warrant special variations of measures such as KEEP and EII. As the Deputy will appreciate, I must be careful not to breach EU rules on regional aid. The second amendment proposes consideration of the extension of a relief in the form of capital allowances on industrial buildings to industries in specified areas in counties Offaly and Longford. In broad terms, an industrial building is a building or structure in use for the purpose of a number of specified trades, including, for example, a trade carried out in a mill, a factory, or other similar premises. A business may claim capital allowances on such buildings, usually at a rate of 4% per annum over 25 years. There is no geographical limit to this provision. Therefore, the relief is already available to businesses incurring qualifying expenditure in the towns named by the Deputy. I would note that capital allowances for capital expenditure on plant and machinery for the purpose of a trade are also available, again, irrespective of the geographic location. If the proposal is to consider widening the scope of relief for industries in the named towns to include buildings that would not normally qualify for industrial building allowances, the committee should be aware that it is not possible for the state to provide geographically targeted tax incentives other than in accordance with EU regional aid guidelines. These do not allow for the level of targeting suggested by the Deputy, and for this reason I cannot accept the proposed amendment. I, of course, listened to what Deputy Naughten said and the different issues that he raised in relation to the future of the power station buildings and his understanding of the work or the plans that ESB have for those buildings in the future. I'll certainly pass on the issues that Deputy Naughten has referred to Minister Ryan, because I have visited one of the power stations that the Deputy has referred to, and I'm well aware of the consequences of that building and not having a viable plan for future use. So I will raise the issues that have been raised by Deputy Naughten with Minister Ryan. As he knows, and indeed he acknowledged, the ESB is a semi-state company. It does make decisions in accordance with its own mandate. But I know they are conscious of the impact of the decisions that they're making on their current and former employees, and they are trying to handle the issues that are at stake here as carefully and as sensitively as possible. I welcome the clarification from the Deputy that the Stay and Spend programme was not designed to deliberately discriminate against any part of the country and against the counties that the Deputy referred to. We do have to ensure that if taxpayers' money is being used to avail of a relief, that it is being used by businesses that are registered for the activity against which the relief is intended. And that is, I think, a very reasonable position to hold. But as the Deputy did clarify, it is absolutely not the intention of the government to discriminate against any part of our country. I have a brief here in front of me in relation to the work that Kieran Mulvey is doing on behalf of the Just Transition Task Force and Commission. I know they published a report on their work on the 22nd of May, and the government made available a further €15 million as part of the July stimulus plan in order to commence a multi-year programme to rehabilitate 33,000 hectares of Boardnamona peatlands. I expect that that kind of commitment will form the core of how we will look to support a just transition in the Midlands region, because of course the government is aware of the many difficulties that have been emphasised by Deputy Naughten in his contribution this morning. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Naughten.
Minister, I've listened carefully to your response, and I'm not going to go back over the issues. Look, we've had these out before, and I've put it clearly on the record here. If you could just, on statistical matter, Minister, just come back with the figures on Stay and Spend to me, I'd appreciate it. Just, I want to make one brief contribution here, Minister, in relation to this. And that is, this time last year, when the decision by An Bord Pleanála to refuse planning permission for the two Midland power stations in Lanesborough and Shannon Bridge to co-fire with biomass. This had an absolutely devastating impact right across the Midland counties. And we were effectively given 12 months' notice of the closure of a major industry, which is the equivalent of Google pulling out with 12 months' notice out of Dublin. And absolutely, if that happened here in Dublin, there would be a task force put in place. And in fairness, there was a task force put in place in the Midlands. All of quite a number of the cabinet came down and met with the communities and representatives of the communities, and I want to acknowledge that, as would happen if Google pulled out of Dublin here. And that task force has made recommendations. The difficulty is, Minister, if that had happened here in Dublin and it was Google pulling out, you can be damn well sure that those recommendations will be implemented. Now, you're telling me here this morning that the recommendations of Kieran Mulvey in terms of alterations to state aid rules that would specifically target investment into the Midland counties. You're not going to do that because you don't want to give preferential treatment to the Midland counties over any other part of the country, even though we're losing the equivalent of Google. Now, I have absolutely no doubt about it that if Google pulled out of the City of Dublin tomorrow morning, some incentive would be put in place to encourage someone to come into that office accommodation in Dublin. But we're saying, no, that's not going to happen in the Midlands. And I'm talking about 20 very specific focus sites. I'm not talking about an across-the-board issue. And if the border counties, if the government appoints a task force and it makes recommendations and specifically recommends alterations targeted at 20 specific locations along the border, I'll fully support that as well. But right across Europe, all of the communities, government organisations and EU-wide organisations, the EU Commission was involved in relation to what we're talking about here as well, have made recommendations that there needs to be alterations to the state aid rules. And you're saying, no, I'm not going to make a special case for the Midland counties, and that's disappointing. The other thing is, Minister, Kieran Mulvey has made very specific recommendations in terms of the 2 power plants in Lanesborough and Shannonbridge, that they should not be demolished and that we should fully explore every possible opportunity for those. And in fairness, I have to say, every single TD, senator and public representative across the Midlands is absolutely unanimous, without exception, that those 2 power plants should not be demolished until all opportunities are explored. Now, I've already put to you this morning that there are 3 power generation opportunities, 2 with private investors that have come to me that are interested in getting involved in this. A 3rd one, which I've articulated before, which I believe, with the proper government structures put in place, is financially viable as well. And yet, we're saying, oh, hands off, the ESB has a commercial mandate. Yes, it does have a commercial mandate, but it is also the sole shareholder is the government. And there is a mechanism for you and Minister Ryan to give a direction directly to the company. I'm not asking it to lose money. I'm not asking it to put take a penny out of his pocket. In fact, the ESB, which I think is really disingenuous, has looked for the €5 million that they put into the Just Transition Fund, have looked for every single electricity customer in this country to actually refund that to them, which I think is wrong. And I don't believe that right across this country, families that are struggling to pay their electricity bill should refund the ESB for the €5 million that it put into the Just Transition Fund. And if any additional money does come through the PSO, that must be ring-fenced and put into that Just Transition Fund and not into the bank balance of the ESB. Thank you, Minister.
Deputy Naughten, Minister.
Thanks again, Deputy. The analogy you draw regarding what would happen if Google was to withdraw out of Dublin, and you making the point that there would be a task force and there would be plans put in place to try to deal with the withdrawal of a large employer from a city. You're correct. It's just that even in that context, the plans to fill a building, the plans to replace jobs would not be through the kind of targeted tax incentives that Deputy Naughten is looking for. We would not be doing that because for a country of our size, we cannot be using tax incentives in the geographically focused way that you're referring to, and leaving aside issues of size. It's far more effective and far more targeted to use grants, to use government expenditure to address the issues that you're referring to. Leaving aside the issue of whether we could use tax incentives, and we've a pretty poor track record of demonstrating that tax incentives can work in terms of urban regeneration or in terms of the regeneration of towns and villages in the way we would want. The way in which we would do it is through the allocation of funding. It's more effective, it can be made more specific, and it can be tailored. And that is exactly what is happening, Deputy. I've already put on the record of the committee the commitment of €15 million to rehabilitate the Boardamona peatlands, the effect that is having. In addition to that, business in the Midlands has secured €6 million worth of funding from the Regional Enterprise Development Fund. That is money that is going in to businesses in the counties and constituencies that the Deputy is referring to. We have the Regional Enterprise Plan for the Midlands, only launched in 2019. That is making progress on some very specific priorities, such as an advanced manufacturing centre for the Midlands, how we can realise the potential for food, for big data in the Midlands, and then also under the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, specific projects have been funded there, Deputy, that look to make progress on particular projects in the counties that Deputy Naughten is referring to. So even in the circumstances of which the Deputy is referring to, we cannot and should not be pretending that tax incentives are the way in which we can make progress. It is more effective, more targeted, and makes better use of our money to spend the taxpayers' money in the areas for the purposes the Deputy is outlining. And that is what is happening. And recognition of that was given just in our July stimulus plan and also in Budget 2021. And the issues that Deputy Naughten is referring to in the use of buildings, and again I've listened to what Deputy Naughten has said on these matters. I will, of course, raise these with Deputy Ryan, Minister Ryan, but they're not issues for progress in the finance bill. But of course, Deputy Naughten is fully entitled to raise them in the debate in the finance bill, which I recognise. Just in relation to one matter that Deputy Naughten did touch on, and I'll come back to him with information in relation to the operation of Stay and Spend once I'm satisfied with that. I have been informed during the debate that other holiday accommodation providers who are not legally obliged, other holiday accommodation providers who are not legally obliged to register with Fáilte Ireland may choose to be voluntarily listed. This requires the service provider to make a self-declaration that their business complies with all statutory requirements. The voluntary application process is very simple and quick and only incurs a nominal fee of €1 for both 2020 and 2021. So in fairness, that won't deal with all of the issues that Deputy Naughten is referring to, because that only refers to businesses who are not voluntarily, who are not required to register with Fáilte Ireland, but I think it's still relevant to the issue that you're referring. Thank you, Cahir.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Naughten, you wish to come back?
Look, I'm going to wrap up now because, look, we're banging our heads off a brick wall here, so to speak, in terms of this. Look, Minister, at the outset, can I say, I understand what you're saying in terms of tax incentives, but you also need to remember and be conscious of the fact that we are very limited in what we can actually put forward in the finance bill. And I'm agnostic here in terms of the vehicles that are used. The core principle here is that there needs to be a specific geographic targeted incentives in relation to these particular locations. Now, you speak about the Regional Enterprise Plan. Of course, as you know, Minister, the Regional Enterprise Plan doesn't include Roscommon and East Galway because Roscommon and East Galway are in the Western Plan. And as we know, whether we like it or not, in terms of whatever way you slice it and dice it, Mayo and Sligo and Galway City disproportionately have a say in relation to that, even though it is a regional plan. And it would make far more sense for Roscommon and East Galway to be part of the Midland plan, where it's pretty ubiquitous across that region in terms of the challenges and issues that were there. Even something as simple as that would make a significant difference, particularly considering when we were in government together, we designated Athlone as one of the growth centres, and yet once you go over the county boundary on the edge of Athlone, you're in a different regional enterprise strategy. So just in terms of the funding and grants, and I accept funding and grants are coming, and yes, it is very welcome. But I've given you a practical example of the challenges in terms of the community in Ballyford. I could give you the same issues in terms of Lanesborough and Clontuskert, in terms of Shannon Bridge, in terms of Ballinasloe, where the exact same issues. I gave you an example yesterday in terms of another aspect of the fund, in terms of the retrofitting of local authority houses. Only local authority houses in mixed housing estates, no rural houses are being included. And look, I've no doubt that you will ensure that that issue is resolved, but it's always the same, that we just cannot get a practical, implementable, focused, targeted initiative. And it's Kieran Mulvey himself, your own Just Transition Commissioner, who has said that we should hold on to the 2 power plants. It's your own Just Transition Commissioner who said that there needs to be targeted geographic incentives put in place. And I'll ask the Minister to mull over it between now and reports